What's up everybody, it's Aaron from Aaron Anderson Photography. In this episode of Behind the Image, we're going to give you a behind the scenes look at a recent portrait session with model and actress Lisbeth Splawn. It's Dan Winters inspired lighting and a whole lot of fun, so let's get started. Let's take a quick second to talk about some of the additional things that we had on set that we don't usually have. For starters, this background behind me. Now, I wanted that kind of Annie Leibovitz look that you've seen with the painter's kind of canvas in the background, but I didn't want to spend a ton of money. A lot of those cost anywhere from like a couple $100s to a couple $1,000 depending on where you buy them. So what do? We go to the hardware store. I went up and down the aisles and I found a painter's canvas drop cloth. And they're literally the things that they put on the floors to stop the paint from going down on the carpets. It cost about $15 for a 6-foot by 9-foot piece, and I started with that. Then I went to the oops department, which is where they bring back paint that the color wasn't quite right. And I found a nice warm gray and came back home. Couple of tips about making these. For starters, the canvas is really wrinkled when you get it out of the bag, so lay it out and iron it so it's nice and smooth. Second, you want to apply a really thin layer of paint to the canvas. If you put in big splotches of it, when you roll it, it'll start to crack. The best way to do that is to take a roller, roll it out nice and thin, and then come back across it with a paintbrush and brush back and forth. It not only gives it some really cool texture, but it keeps the paint nice and even so that when you roll it, you don't have any cracking or any problems. The second thing we made was actually the table that you see in the shot. And that we just bought a couple pieces of lumber. I bought some ebony stain, stained it, and then I sanded it down to give it that distressed kind of satin finish. As far as lighting goes, we had our typical Elinchrom BX500RIs as our key light and as our fill, and I had the Elinchrom D-Light RX4 as a background light, and we had a strip box on top of that. In addition to the strip box, we had a couple other modifiers. Our key light had a 12-degree spot grid on it, and our fill light, which was really fun, had a 75-inch indirect light motive octabox on it. This is quickly becoming one of my favorite modifiers to use, and I'm hoping to do something with a little more tutorial-driven stuff in the future so that you guys can see how versatile it actually is. But without further ado, let's hop into Photoshop, show you some diagrams, and hopefully you guys can use this lighting setup on your next photo shoot. All right, everyone, welcome to Photoshop, and we are about to dive into the diagrams for our shoot with Lisbeth Splawn. We're going to start with this image right here, which is a really moody, kind of sad feeling portrait almost. And again, these are inspired by Dan Winters, and love his lighting style. Wanted to do something similar but not copy him. Dan Winters, if you have never seen his work before, you should definitely check it out at danwintersphoto.com. But without any delay, let's jump into the diagrams about how we achieve this image. So at first glance, it's a little bit complicated. It's not too crazy once you get the hang of it, but it is a 3-light setup. So let's start with our key light, which is this 12-degree spot grid right here. Now, we did have tape over either side of the spot grid as well to narrow it to kind of a rectangle beam. And then what we did to control the light even further was put one large flag right in front of it, and that was really to control any spill from falling back here on the background. So anything that was going to come this direction, we just wanted to flag it off with that big flag. Then to create a nice kind of crisp shadow on the model's face, we have a small flag a little bit closer. And as you guys know, the closer you get a flag to the subject, the harder that shadow is going to be. And so this one's going to control that shadow that's falling right across her face right here. And then we have our table that we talked about how we made and our background. For the background, we have a 14-inch by 35-inch strip box, and it really is almost pointed away from the background so that we can just get a really soft gradient going this direction. And I didn't want this to get any brighter, just a little bit to the side to get some separation. Now that seems like it's a decent setup, but in order to get some of the detail back in the shadows, you need to fill that in somehow, but you don't want it to be really obvious. Now, from what I've seen with Dan Winters, his stuff, he uses a ring flash, which just goes right over your lens and points straight at the model.
But I don't have one of those, so what did we use? We used this big 75-inch light motive indirect octa. The lighting coming off these is really, really beautiful and extremely soft. And the great thing about the size is you can have it directly behind you and it'll just wrap around you and go straight into the model. So we had this light set up on a really low power, just shooting straight at the model, and that was just to fill in some of those shadows so we could get some of the detail back in the coat and the table and the zipper. We'll go back to that really quick so you can see some of the nice detail, especially in the zipper and on the jacket that starts to get a little bit filled in from that big octabox. So now let's talk about this kind of vintage inspired shoot that we did as well. It's kind of a throwback to the 20s era where they were using those harsh hot lights and you had those really crisp and awesome shadows with a lot of shape and depth. So this one was a pretty easy setup. It was actually just a 17-inch beauty dish on camera right. And we did again use that large flag to control the spill of the beauty dish, not only on the background, but on the model's face. So it wasn't just blasting light all over the hat and all over her shoulder. Then we had that same 75-inch indirect octabox set up behind the camera just to fill in a little bit under the hat so that eye didn't go completely to black, as well as the lipstick and that kind of thing. We did move the model a little bit farther away from the background to darken it up a bit, and I obviously got in quite a bit closer on this one just to get a closer up headshot with her. So that's it for that one. Nothing super complicated, but a cool, quick setup that you can do on the go. Again, that's just a 17-inch beauty dish, a large flag, and a 75-inch light motive indirect octa. Before we sign off, I wanted to address really quickly some thoughts on what to do if you don't have a huge 75-inch indirect octabox, which I feel like a lot of people don't. And there are some thoughts on how you can get that effect just a little bit cheaper. The first one is to bounce the light off of something, especially if you have a white wall in your studio or where you're shooting. Just take all modifiers off your light. I would say bare bulb, turn it around, and shoot it straight into the wall. And that's going to give you a nice, big, soft light source. Just turn it down to a low power and you can get a similar effect. The second thing you can do, and this isn't necessarily a cheap alternative, but you could use a ring flash. Like I said in the beginning, that's what I think Dan Winters does. But that is a pretty expensive option. I actually think you'd be better off using something like the indirect octabox. But those are a couple options that you could use just in case. You could also make a large reflector, say out of white foam core. If you had a V-flat or something like that, you could bounce the light off of one of those from behind your camera and get the same kind of fill effect. Really, the goal is to take those shadows away from black so you can get some of the highlights and get a little bit more detail back into those shadows. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Behind the Image. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message or post a comment below. In the meantime, we should have more shoots coming up shortly with behind the scenes and all kinds of good stuff for you. If you would kindly click that like button and hit subscribe. And until next time, be awesome.